In national news, it's been 2 days since the drone strike in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. military members and injured more than 24 others, a strike that the U.S. now believes was conducted by Iran.
Western Mass News reporter Matt Price spoke with a local military expert about how the United States should respond.
It has been a dramatic last 48 hours for the United States, especially for the Biden administration. This after an enemy drone launched a strike against the Tower 22 desert base in Jordan, taking the lives of 3 service members and wounding several others. Like the U.S. government, Gary LaForte, a retired professor of international business at American International College, blames the strike on Iran.
This attack is part of a series of attacks, approximately 165 that have taken place, I think as of today, that have been directed against U.S. military assets in both Iraq and Syria.
LaForte says these attacks are because of the country's continued assistance to Israel in their war against Hamas, following the terror group's barbaric attacks on October 7th. The Biden administration recently vowing retaliatory action for this recent attack that took the lives of 46-year-old Sergeant William Jerome Rivers, 24-year-old Specialist Kennedy Layden Sanders, and 23-year-old Specialist Breonna Alexandria Moffett. The former Army officer tells Western Mass News he is concerned the administration has been slow in responding to previous attacks during the conflict and that they should send a clear message based on how they strike back here.
They may decide to go directly at the organization that was responsible for the attack, maybe in killing its leadership or killing or attacking their military assets or attacking those facilities that are launching the mortar and missile and rocket attacks.
LaForte tells us there is also the possibility of the U.S. increasing sanctions against Iran. As all of this is unfolding, the U.S. is deploying combat troops and National Guard members to the Middle East, including the 1st Battalion 181st Infantry Regiment that was sent off last week in Worcester.
Now we are starting to send in combat troops that will be deployed probably in those locations where we currently have military soldiers. There could be more troops going into Syria, possibly. As far as Israel itself goes, I would expect if they were deployed to Israel, they would not be in a combat, but more a support training type role.
Matt Price, Western Mass News.